The title of our presentation today is Sustaining Practices, a Multivocal Approach to Archiving. A linguist, Karthick Narayanan, and an ethnomusicologist, myself, collaborated in the project that we'd like to present to you today. Archives have been important to linguists, ethnomusicologists, and the communities we work with for the preservation of cultural heritage as a rich research resource and increasingly for community empowerment, especially with the digital turn and the consciousness for repatriation of archival materials. Archives offer communities access to their own cultural materials in efforts to revitalize languages and sustain cultural practices. In the context of sustaining practices, archives have been increasingly becoming important in revitalization efforts because they serve as repositories for practices, for documentation, and that can serve as sources for developing educational tools and support systems for communities. They are important to cultural continuity, and they also give researchers and communities access to authentic received materials. Authentic used in the sense of that these are received materials which are available as received. Users of archives range from researchers and academics to community members, to educators and language revitalization practitioners, to creative practitioners such as musicians and artists, and to the general public. A range of stakeholders who have a variety of distance from the objects in archives, and hence different perspectives on what should be the use and access given to people on archival material. The ethics of archival practice then becomes extremely important. Increasingly, with the digital turn, the circulation of archival material has increased, repatriation efforts have also increased, which then becomes more important for us to think about what might be some of the problems that archives might present in the contemporary age, which is a digital age. Over a decade of work or more has gone into thinking about the challenges that archives, and especially digital archives, present. A very evocative turn of phrase is used by Anthony Seeger in a 2022 article in which he talks about the tragedy of Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty, as we all know, is a rhyme which speaks of Humpty Dumpty who fell off a wall and splintered, and all the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So the issue of fragmentation is one of the central problems that archives present. Fragmentation occurs in more than one way. Usually, archival objects capture only fragments of linguistic or musical events, very often without context. And with the digital turn and digital archiving, there is a data stream that comes to represent what used to be a cultural practice in which knowledge bearers have a stake. So knowledge becomes a fragmented data stream. The access and relevance of archives is also something that is contested by the range of stakeholders because they have very different perspectives on who should have access to the data and for what purpose, which brings ethical considerations to the fore. This comes up very nicely in the term schizophonia and schismogenesis in the field of sound archives, where schizophonia is the separation of sound from source. And schismogenesis is when these sound objects separated from source become available for sampling, mediation, and transformation over which the source has no control or little control. And when you add that together with commercialization and commodification, very often power imbalances result in culture bearers losing control over cultural property that is rightfully theirs. So digital dispossession then becomes doubly a problem, because in the digital era, not only have culture bearers become separated from their own objects of culture, these objects of culture can then circulate widely in the digital world, which, with the advent of AI, has become, and of social media, has become an extremely exacerbated problem. So this is the kind of situation in which Karthik, Narayan, and I actually have a proposal to make, in which we are hoping that we will have a prototype for putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, perhaps doing better than All the King's Horses and All the King's Men. So we call this proposal going from data back to knowledge, and for which we have two case studies of Toda verbal art and of Drupad, which is a North Indian classical vocal practice. The Drupad archive is an ethnomusicology archive of a tradition that has medieval origins, 5 lineages associated with the erstwhile princely court of Betia in the modern state of Bihar. It's a very endangered practice where only 2 lineages survive with just 1 expert knowledge bearer each. There has been an erosion of knowledge, intelligibility, and expertise. And on the other hand, it's a very historic tradition going back to the 15th century, and the repertoire is extremely rich. The aesthetics and musicological value is very unique in Hindustani music history. So I'll now hand over to Karthik Narayan to present the Toda verbal art case study and to talk about our proposal.
Thank you, Sumitra. Before we discuss the design principles of the multivocal archiving, let us have a quick look at the Toda community and their verbal art. The Todas are a small pastoral group from the Nilgiri highlands in Tamil Nadu, India. They are considered autochthonous to the Nilgiri mountains, referring to themselves all, and their language is all Posh. All Posh is a critically endangered language. The Toda verbal art could be broadly classified into 2 domains: lyrical genre and narrative genre. Kwasem, Osh, Pot, and Tim are part of the lyrical genre. Paim, Kol are part of the narrative genre. These genres are classified based on theme, performers, locale, phraseology, and lexical choices. The Toda verbal collection, that is part of this prototype archive, has been collected with the support from Sahitya Academy 2015, Indian Council for Social Science Research 2016-2018, Sahitya Motri Satyanarayana Postdoctoral Fellowship 2022 to 2024. Before we designed the design principles of the multivocal archive, we had a sort of an engagement with the community members to understand what is their requirement and thought on archiving. So based on this, we arrived at a few 3 significant conclusions: that they want us to treat archived materials as cultural assets, acknowledge the significance of the objects to the community, preferred flexibility, shared responsibility, and community engagement with the archive, wanted cultural values, practices, and community priorities in shaping access to the archived materials. Community engaged archiving was the model, and then based on this, we decided the multivocal design principles. 5 key items make up the design principle. They are co-custody approach, the decentralized collaborative management, and the sharing of control among community and researchers. Community-centric management, decisions around appraisal and selection are shaped by cultural values, practice, and priorities of the communities involved. Culturally motivated arrangement, there's an emphasis on flexibility and engagement with cultural categories in representing knowledge. Thick descriptive framework, a multi-layered descriptive schema that captures the dynamic of interaction and not just the staticity of the object. Community-specific access condition, responsible access rather than open access to archived materials. Here, responsibility refers to cultural sensitivity and individual privacy. Appraisal is the process of deciding which materials are worth preserving for long term. Each archive defines its own criteria for inclusion and exclusion based on its mission and goals. Appraisal decisions are based on several key factors, but some of the common things that is common among several archives are content, usefulness, condition, and relevance. Appraisal in traditional archiving, especially in linguistics and ethnomusicology traditions, we see that there are linguistics is guided by traditional principles, technocratic principles, including recording hours, data volume, file format, and quantitative metrics, especially while deciding projects to be granted for archiving, for documentation and archiving, are degree of endangerment and quality and quantity of documentation, as in POSTLANG documentation score, and sometimes by programmatic policies like the Indian University of Grand Commission's Center for Endangered Languages and Central Institute of Indian Languages Scheme for Protection and Preservation of Endangered Languages. These two programs focused on documenting languages that are spoken by less than 10,000 speakers, especially those that are spoken by the tribal communities of India. On the side of the ethnomusicology, we find that perception bias in the modern context, notions of values in Indian classical music are driven by consumer public and their perception of great performance and great tradition. As a consequence, only handful of traditions attract researchers, funding, and patronage in archiving projects. Similarly, reductionist bias, in other terms, objectification, decontextualized objects, loss of intelligibility. While musical performance is culturally situated, the archival object is the digital audio object cut and reduced from its cultural associations. So consequence is that archival objects focus on acoustic competence as opposed to cultural value and cultural competence. Appraisal and selection in the prototype. Toda verbal art, who decides, engage community members and researchers. The guiding principles are to be reflective of linguistic practice as opposed to being representative sampling of the practice, to be holistic as opposed to be fragmented or fragmentic. At the ethnomusicology Baitia collection, Baitia Drupad collection, we want the archive to document the cultural knowledge system as opposed to representative sampling of the expert practices. Focus on intelligibility rather than pure sound. Archive thick sound, which is sound interanimated by its connection to places, not just archive the auditory objects. Both these collections had common guiding principles that sought to sustain or to aid in sustaining linguistic practices and cultural practices, and not just in description of language or not just in preserving an endangered practice as relic. It sought to be collectively beneficial both to the community and the researchers. After the selection of the objects, the next is to arrange them into logical order, logical and meaningful order. Traditional archiving practices revolve around two principles for arrangement. Those are principles of provenance and principles of original order. Principles of provenance wants to organize records based on their origin or the activity of the entity that created them, replace arbitrary subject-based arrangements with a method that reflects the organic activity of the record-creating entity. Original order, on the other hand, seeks to maintain the record in the order they were created and used during their active lives. It seeks to preserve the context and meaning of the records, showing how entity functioned and conducted its activity with or through the object. At the prototype, the archival arrangement is guided by the principle of organic value and utility, which is basically a rereading of original order, provenance, and respective context with the community on grouping and subgrouping of the files. We sought to arrange objects that would reveal the interactional activities that led to the creation of the records, reflect the functions of the objects in the practice, enhancing the records, information, and cultural value. At the Toda collection level, the arrangement seeks to reflect the community-specific verbal activity at the top level, such as singing and narrating. Performance type and locale guides the subgrouping at the collection level. Community classification patterns and labels are used throughout the arrangement. Thus, by the use of community-derived categories, the prototype archive preserves the information and cultural value of the Toda verbal art, making them intelligible and meaningful for both Toda community members and the external researchers. At the Baitia Drupad collection, we sought to reflect community-specific aesthetic categories and understanding through arrangement and preserve non-auditory contextual information to capture the ephemeral histories of interactivity in arrangement, which reflects the life of an object in an oral tradition, as well as histories of listening practice of the community. Thus, by capturing categories of thick sound, the prototype archive tries to capture the interactions within which the Metia Drupad performances become intelligible, making them meaningful for both the community members and the external researchers. Here you see a snapshot of the workshop that we held with the Toda community members, and on the board, on the white board, you see the arrangement patterns that we were working out with the community. The arrangement schema worked out with the community is represented in the DSpace repository platform on which we are building the archive, using its using its community and collection features. On the left, you see the DSpace model, and on the right, you see the Toda verbal arrangement as an example for this. Next to description, most of the existing descriptive standards within linguistics and ethnomusicology archives use one of the existing metadata standards that were derived from DC. IMDI and OLAC are famous among linguistic archives, or more popular among linguistic archive, and DataCite is something that is used most frequently within ethnomusicology archive. Now, what are the problems that we found with existing metadata schema is that they were thin metadata schema. So one of the guiding principles of our multivocal archive is to introduce thick metadata schema. The thick metadata schema tries to capture the dynamic interactivity and multivocality, not just the unitary static objects. Captures listening as an interactive, intelligible experience that fosters creativity in performance, especially in the context of ethnomusicology archive. Wants to document relationship between individual items in the archive. Capture histories of interactivity with the object. This includes this thick data of acoustamic context, such as historical materials, ritual patronage, community performance context, memories, performance histories, metaphor, embodied knowledge, and human service. And we also want to acknowledge that different items in the archives may conflict in their representation of the object, capturing stakeholders' views as part of an internal debate within a living tradition. So the descriptive schema that we then worked out is spread across the DSpace arrangement level, each at community level, collection level, item level, and at the file level. We have assigned descriptive metadata. Now, at the community and the collection level, metadata is more unstructured and much more narrative in nature. The item and wisdom level metadata are structured and are adopted from an existing standard. We could take more about these questions, more about this in the question answer session. And similarly, in this data, we are not getting into the details of the access restriction. The access restrictions are mapped to or mapped at the item level and also at the bitstream level, based on community considerations. Thank you.